Ever get that feeling? Like you were meant for something bigger. Sure. That this life, right here, right now, is just a single chapter in a much grander story.
Oh, I have to confess, the thought crosses my mind more often than you might think.
Well, get ready to have that feeling amplified because the source material for this deep dive dives headfirst into that very idea.
Really?
We're exploring eternity, predestination, and God's plan. And trust me, some of these concepts are seriously challenging what I thought I knew about, well, pretty much everything. We've got a stack of PDF excerpts here, seemingly part of a larger theological work.
It's fascinating stuff. The author starts by really emphasizing this idea of before the beginning. Not just the beginning of our universe, but a time before time itself.
Ooh.
Drawing on passages like before the foundation of the world, before the beginning of the ages.
Okay, pause right there.
Yeah.
That's what I mean about challenging everything. Help me wrap my head around this. Time as we experience it has a beginning and an end. How can there be a before that?
And that's exactly the point the author wants to drive home. Our human understanding of time, with its neat little timeline, might be a very limited perspective. The text argues that God exists outside of time as we know it.
So are we talking about a different dimension, a different realm?
In a way, yes. And the author uses this concept to reframe our understanding of God's knowledge.
Okay.
They highlight that God's awareness of us predates our physical existence, citing verses like Jeremiah 1.5, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you."
Okay, so not just knowing we would exist someday, but knowing us, specifically, all the way back in that time before time. What are the implications of that? That feels huge, but I'm not sure I'm fully grasping why.
It challenges our linear thinking about life. This eternal perspective, as the author calls it, suggests our lives are woven into a larger preordained plan. It even changes how we think about the past. The author quotes Ecclesiastes 3.15, "God restores what has passed," implying that even events in the past are part of this eternal framework.
Okay, so let's say I'm starting to buy into this idea of existing in some way before the beginning. How does that change my perspective on my life right now? Does it make my worries feel smaller knowing they're just blips on this grand timeline?
That's one way to look at it. The author connects this concept to Christ's sacrifice.
Okay.
From this eternal perspective, it wasn't a single event in history, but an act with implications that stretch back to that period before the beginning and forward into eternity.
The author uses the phrase, a sacrifice in time from eternity. It's almost like saying that sacrifice has always existed and always will, right?
Exactly. It transcends our linear understanding of time.
Okay.
And this leads to another key concept, predestination.
Predestination, always a head scratcher. If God's plan is already set, what does that mean for our choices? Do we even have free will?
It's a common question, and the author tackles it head-on, but not in the way you might expect. The text seems to be saying that God's foreknowledge and predestination aren't a limitation on our free will, but rather an expression of his love and a plan for our ultimate good. The author points to Ephesians 1.4. He chose us in him before the foundation of the world.
That's where I get tripped up, though. Chosen for what exactly? And if we're already chosen, does that undermine our ability to make different choices?
That's where the author gets really interesting. They use this analogy of a contract presented in that eternal realm before time. Some chose to align with God's plan, while others chose a different path. Think of figures like the angels who remain faithful, and then contrast that with the choice of Lucifer.
You've got my attention with this contract. What kind of deal are we talking about, and how does knowing about it, if it's true, impact how I live my life today? What am I agreeing to without even knowing it?
That's the heart of it, isn't it? And it ties directly into the author's ideas about grace. In fact, they talk about two types of grace. A first grace given before time, and a second grace that we experience here on earth.
Two graces. All right, now you've officially blown my mind.
Right.
Let's unpack that. What is first grace if we're talking about existence before we even existed? What did we need grace for back then?
This is where the author's interpretation of Scripture gets really thought-provoking.
Okay.
This first grace, as they describe it, refers to that initial state of existence with God before the physical realm, that perfect communion and alignment with God's plan. It was a state of pure grace.
Okay, I'm with you so far. But then we get to this physical world with all its messiness. So the second grace comes in to sort of course correct.
You could say that.
Yeah.
It's the opportunity amidst all the challenges of the physical world to reconnect with God's original plan. Even though we've entered this physical realm with its limitations, This second grace is our chance to realign with that eternal plan that first grace offered before time even began.
So how do we access this second grace? Is it automatic because we're here, or do we have to do something to activate it? And what does that even look like in a practical sense? All right, so we're talking about two graces, one that connects us to that existence before time, and one that helps us navigate this physical world. How does that even work? What does that look like in real life?
The author ties this concept of second grace directly to Christ's sacrifice.
Okay.
They're saying it's not just about forgiveness of sins, but about bridging that gap created by entering this physical realm. It's
Yeah.
about reconnecting us to that original state of first grace.
So when we talk about accepting Christ, we're not just signing up for a belief system, we're agreeing to something much, much bigger.
That's how the author seems to see it.
Why?
It's like stepping back into that eternal contract, realigning ourselves with God's plan for us, for all of creation, really.
Okay, and that takes us back to the language of God.
Mhm.
If this second grace is about realignment, how does speaking God's language factor into that?
This is where things get really practical. The author describes the language of God as a way of thinking and speaking that aligns with eternal truths, not just our temporary circumstances. It's about shifting our perspective from the limitations we see around us to the boundless possibilities that exist in the spiritual realm.
You're saying that the way we think and talk actually has an impact on our ability to tap into that second grace, that reconnection with God's plan.
Exactly. It's like tuning our minds and hearts to the frequency of eternity.
Wow.
It's about recognizing those whispers of first grace that are still present within us, even in the midst of chaos.
So when we get bogged down by worry, fear, negativity, are we essentially tuning out the language of God?
That's one way to look at it. The author even uses the story of Lucifer to illustrate this point, though, in a much more dramatic way.
Okay, Lucifer, talk to me about how he plays into this idea of language shaping reality.
The author, drawing on biblical imagery, paints this picture of Lucifer as originally a shining being in heaven, totally aligned with God, but then something shifted pride, perhaps. Whatever it was, it changed his language, his internal dialogue. He started to focus on himself, on his own desires, instead of on God.
So are you saying that a shift in language and focus led to Lucifer's fall?
That's the author's argument, yes. And they argue that this fall, this separation from God, is what necessitated the creation of the physical world as we know it.
Wait a minute, back up. Lucifer's fall led to the creation of everything. How does the author explain that connection?
It's a complex idea, but essentially the author suggests that this physical realm became a necessary stage for a new act in this cosmic drama of redemption.
Okay.
Think of it as a consequence, perhaps, or maybe even a chance for a new beginning, a way to work towards healing that separation.
So our very existence as physical beings is a result of this cosmic event, this fall from grace.
In a sense, yes. And the author says that this is why we experience limitations, suffering, even death. They're all part of this physical realm, a consequence of that initial separation from God.
Okay, I'm trying to follow this. We've gone from two graces to the language we use to Lucifer's fall leading to the creation of the physical world. It's a lot, but I'm with you so far.
Yeah.
So if all of that is true, how do we as physical beings in this physical world get back to that original state of first grace? How do we bridge that gap?
That is the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the author is very clear on their answer. It's through Christ.
Right.
They believe that Christ, as the eternal Son of God, chose to enter this physical realm to become part of this drama, specifically to bridge that gap.
So it's deeper than just forgiveness.
Much deeper. The author suggests that by accepting Christ, by embracing this eternal perspective, we're actively choosing to align ourselves with God's plan for restoration. We're choosing to move from the realm of separation back into that eternal embrace of love and grace.
So this isn't just a personal spiritual journey. We're part of something much larger, a cosmic story of redemption.
Precisely, and that's what makes this conversation so exciting, because it's not just about understanding these concepts intellectually.
Right.
It's about allowing them to transform how we live our lives here and now.
Okay, so how do we do that?
Yeah.
How do we take all of this cosmic drama, these graces, this eternal language, and apply it to our everyday lives?
That's exactly what I was hoping you'd ask, because the author actually gets very practical about that very question, but I think it deserves its own dedicated exploration.
All right, listeners, you heard it here. We're saving the best for last. Be sure to tune in to part 3, where we'll dive into the practical applications of these mind-blowing concepts.
Absolutely.
We'll discover how embracing this eternal perspective can empower us to live more fulfilling, purposeful, and grace-filled lives. Don't miss it. Last time we left off with a pretty big question. How do we actually apply these huge cosmic ideas to our everyday lives?
It's one thing to talk about eternal contracts in the language of God,
Right.
but how do we translate that into something real?
Yeah.
Something we can use to navigate work, relationships,
Yeah.
all the messy bits of being human.
Exactly. I'm ready to move past the theoretical and get practical.
Okay.
Where do the authors suggest we start?
Well, they spend a lot of time on this idea that simply understanding our eternal nature can be incredibly empowering.
Okay.
They argue it's like seeing our lives through a new lens, one that changes how we view not just the big picture, but the day-to-day stuff too.
Okay, so new lens, new perspective. What does that look like in practice? Give me an example.
Let's take the concept of predestination.
Okay.
It can be easy to fall into a trap of thinking, if God already knows how my life is going to play out, why bother trying to make good choices?
I'll admit, I've definitely had that thought.
Yeah.
It can feel like we have less agency, less responsibility for our actions. So how does the author address that?
They flip the script. Instead of viewing predestination as a limitation,
Okay.
they see it as the ultimate affirmation.
Okay.
It's like God saying, I know your heart, I know your potential, and I'm 100% confident you'll choose the path that aligns with my plan.
So instead of being passive, we're empowered to step into the role God already knows we're capable of filling.
Exactly, and that's where the language of God comes in. The author believes that aligning our words and actions with the truths of God's preordained plan can actually influence our present reality.
So we're not just talking about avoiding curse words here.
Yeah.
What does it actually mean to speak the language of God?
It's about shifting our focus from limitations to possibilities. It's recognizing that the God who spoke the universe into being is also present in the smallest details of our lives.
Give me an example. What's a practical way I can start speaking that language in my daily life?
Think about a time you were facing a challenge.
Okay.
What kind of language were you using internally and out loud?
Okay.
Were you speaking from a place of fear, doubt, limitation?
Yeah.
Or were you drawing on the language of faith, hope, and trust in God's plan?
That's really powerful.
Yes.
It makes me realize how often I've limited myself with my own words, my own negativity.
Exactly. And the author suggests that when we shift our language,
Yep.
we shift our energy, we start to align ourselves with the frequency of eternity, that first grace that's always been within us. And that's when we start to see real transformation.
So even when we're in the middle of a tough situation, we can choose to speak God's language, words of faith, hope, and trust. We can choose to believe in a positive outcome, even if we can't yet see it.
Precisely. It's not about denying reality. It's about choosing to see it through the lens of eternity, through the lens of God's love and power.
This has been such an incredible conversation. Expert speaker, I feel like we've gone from the cosmos to the very core of my being and back again.
It's amazing how these ideas, while rooted in theology, can have such a practical impact on how we live our lives.
So for our listeners who are ready to put all of this into practice, what's one tangible step they can take away from today's deep dive?
Pay attention to your language. Become aware of the words you're using both internally and externally. Are they life-giving? Are they aligned with the truth of who God says you are? If not, choose to shift your language. Start speaking words of faith, hope, and gratitude. You might be surprised by the transformative power of your own words. Such a good reminder. We've reached the end of our deep dive for today, but our hope is that this is just the beginning of a much longer journey of exploration for you. We encourage you to revisit the concepts we discussed, read the source material for yourselves, and most importantly, start putting these ideas into practice in your own life.
And remember, you're not alone on this journey. You have everything you need within you to tap into the power of eternity and live a life that reflects the fullness of who you were created to be.